بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers and sisters and friends, and welcome to today's webinar, which is on No God, No Good, the argument from morality. During this webinar, brothers and sisters and friends, we're going to try and cover the following. The first thing is we need to understand key terms, because what we're going to be engaging with are ideas and concepts that relate to the domain of knowledge and philosophy called moral ontology or metaethics. And this is something that we're going to obviously explain during the appropriate slide. And it's important to understand certain key terms that we're going to be using throughout this webinar, because otherwise we won't understand that much, or we will, but basically it's very important to get a clear picture in terms of the language that we're using. But it's significant from the point of view that when we're engaging in the public domain, using this argument, trying to articulate to our brothers and sisters in humanity that if you believe in objective moral values, then that necessitates the existence of God. If you're going to articulate that to them and they would have certain ideas or knowledge relating to that domain of knowledge, they're going to be using certain terms, and you have to understand those terms. So it's very important that we speak in a language that people understand, and that obviously varies at different levels. But specifically when you're using this argument and people are going to understand your terms or understand your argument, they may be aware of certain language, and that language is going to be used, and you need to understand the meaning of various items, lexical items, if you like, in order to engage with people in the most appropriate way. So we're going to cover some key terms. Then we're going to talk about, well, what is objective morality? What is the nature of objective morality from a meta-ethics or moral ontological point of view? Then we're going to go straight into it. We're going to talk about the argument for morality, which really in a nutshell basically says that objective moral values or objective moral properties exist because God exists. And then we're going to engage with the possible alternatives, which obviously are false. And what we mean by alternatives here are alternatives to explain objective morality, alternatives to ground objective morals, objective moral properties. And obviously I'm going to explain what that terminology means further. But basically we're going to go through the potential or possible alternatives, which include biology, social consensus, and moral realism. Then we're going to deal with Euthyphro's dilemma, which is a dilemma that Plato articulated. And this dilemma is a false dilemma, and we're going to explain why it's a false dilemma. Because for a dilemma to be a dilemma, there can only be two options. But the minute we can introduce a third alternative, then that dilemma is no longer a dilemma, it becomes a false dilemma. Then we're going to quickly go through this new idea, or this emerging idea in metaethics, which is evolutionary moral realism. Now, there was a book that was published in 2020, which part of my research at the University of London, I had to respond to their attempt to ground objective moral values or objective moral properties in evolution, in an evolutionary understanding. And my argument was, well, if they are coherent, then what that does, it basically undermines truth as a moral value. Because if you believe truth is a moral value, that truth has intrinsic moral value, it's objective from that point of view, then truth is undermined by evolutionary moral realism. And the reason I want to quickly talk about this, because we're going to probably do a webinar in the future just on this topic, because it's new research, is based on responding to an argument in metaethics that was published in 2020. So we're going to go through it into detail, but I wanted to mention it because, just briefly at least, just to show that you're going to get different manifestations or different expressions of a kind of naturalistic argument to try and show that objective moral values exist and you can explain that in reference to the Darwinian paradigm or evolution or biology. And each of those expressions or conceptions are false or incoherent. And I wanted to show you that when we look at truth as a moral value, well, that is undermined based on the evolutionary moral realism, which we're going to discuss a little later. Then we're going to talk about, well, we may even do this early actually. None of this is in accurate order, but we're also going to talk about the different Islamic perspectives on objective morality. Obviously, we don't want to misrepresent the Islamic tradition, because we do believe that there are other schools of creed. For example, the Ash'ari and the Athari creed and the Maturidi creed, they have different conceptions and perspectives on the idea of objective moral properties or objective moral values in the cosmos, in the universe. And we're going to briefly touch on that. We're also going to talk about the implications for atheism, meaning, well, what does it mean if even an atheist were to believe in the axiom, in the non-negotiable axiom that there are objective moral properties and values? And what does that mean? Well, number one, it means that God must exist. And if they reject that, or they reject their axiom, they reject the idea that there are objective moral values, then they're free to do so, but that has some significant implications when it comes to religious and atheist discourse. And we're going to explain what that is. And finally, and this is a theme that I try to stick to when we talk about intellectual things, philosophical ideas, theo-philosophical ideas, I like to always link it to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's very important to always do that, because we're not kind of, we don't do abstract philosophy. When we articulate theo-philosophical arguments, or when we articulate arguments that exist within Islamic thought, it's very important to understand the reason why we're doing it. We're not doing it just to sound smart or just to prove ourselves right, but we're doing it because we want hearts to engage with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We want people's hearts to understand that Allah is the only deity worthy of worship, and they live a life in accordance to that. So it's very important to always link our intellectual ideas to our raison d'etre, our reason for existence, which is to worship Allah, which basically means to know Him, to love Him, to obey Him, and to direct all acts of worship to Him alone. So don't worry if you feel a bit confused, or if we use any tough language, difficult language, don't worry. We're going to basically break it down further as we continue in this webinar. So let's talk about certain terms. So the first thing you need to understand, that I might be using terms such as metaethics or moral ontology. So what does this mean? Well, the domain of knowledge in philosophy called moral ontology or metaethics really refers to the kind of nature and foundations and scope of moral values, okay? So when we say, for example, justice is a moral value or justice is a moral property, what we try and answer are the following questions. Does justice exist? What kind of value is justice? Where did the value of justice come from? Why is being just binding? Why do we have a duty to be just? So this is the kind of questions that metaethics or moral ontology deals with. It deals with the kind of source and nature of moral values or properties. And this is slightly different, or fundamentally different, to moral epistemology, because it focuses not on morality itself, but it focuses on what is moral. But before I get into that, there are other ideas or concepts and terms that you're going to be hearing in this domain of knowledge. And these include moral realism and moral anti-realism. Now, you could probably guess what this really means based upon the terms themselves. Now, when we're talking about moral realism, we're basically saying moral properties or moral values are objective, which means they are mind independent. They're not based on one's mind or individual's mind or psychological disposition. So they're out there in the real world, they're out there in the cosmos, so to speak. Moral anti-realism is basically the opposite of that. The anti-realists, moral anti-realists basically say that moral properties are mind dependent, meaning there's nothing out there in the real world that you would consider as a moral value or moral property. It just exists in one's mind, okay? It just exists in one's mind. And this is why you don't really require to answer the moral ontological questions such as, where did it come from? Why is it mind independent? Because you don't have to answer those questions, because if you're moral anti-realist, well, number one, moral values and properties are mind dependent, so it's just not an issue. And they don't really exist in the real world, outside in the cosmos, so to speak. So they don't require any ontological grounding. They don't require any foundational explanation. You don't have to explain why they are objective, and you don't have to explain where they came from, okay? Now, moral epistemology, as I said earlier, really focuses on, well, what is morality in terms of what is moral? How do we know what is good and bad? And we have to understand the distinction and make the distinction between metaethics, moral ontology, and moral epistemology. Because moral ontology focuses on morality itself. It refers to the foundation, the nature of moral properties or moral values. For example, why is justice a moral value? Why is it objective, or how is it objective? And where did the moral property or moral value of justice come from? Okay, that's moral ontology. But moral epistemology is, well, how do we know what is good or bad? How do we know what is just? That's the question. How do we know what is fair? So these are two distinctions that we need to make. One is about metaethics or moral ontology. One is moral epistemology. So just to repeat, moral ontology is about answering the question, why are these moral values objective, or what is the nature of moral values and properties? And the other question is, well, where did moral values come from? Whereas moral epistemology, it focuses on, well, how do we know what is good? How do we know what is bad? How do we know what is just? How do we know what is fair? How do we know what is injustice? How do we know what is unfair? So these are some important topics, important terms rather, for you to understand, in order for us to a little bit more get some clarity when we're discussing these ideas during this webinar. So I need to consider this picture. I really do apologize if anyone is fasting today, or they're a bit squeamish, or they just don't like seeing blood. Now, for those who don't know what this is a spinal cord operation, okay? It's a spinal cord operation. Now, I want you to imagine the surgeon who is partaking in this spinal cord operation. He is a malicious, evil surgeon. And what he decides to do, he decides to deliberately, with intent, to snip the spinal cord of this patient for no good reason, no medical justification whatsoever. The only justification that he has, which is not really a justification, but the only reason that he has is he's this malicious and he's evil. He decides to snip with intent the spinal cord of this innocent patient. Now, I want to ask you a question. What are your moral intuitions here? Would you all agree to say that what this surgeon has done is morally bad, is morally evil? I think majority of you, if not 100%, would say absolutely yes. Okay, good. Well, let me ask you another question. Is what the surgeon did objectively morally wrong? So there are two different questions here. Understand the subtle distinction. The first question is what the surgeon did morally wrong? Everyone says yes. The second question is what the surgeon did objectively morally wrong? Now, again, your intuitions might say, yes, of course it's objectively morally wrong. Well, we have to first understand what do we mean by objective, okay? Because there is a particular meaning here when we're talking about objective. We're not saying something is objective just because everybody agrees with it. Excuse me. We're not saying something is objective because the majority of sane and rational people agree with it. We're not saying it's objective because the moral philosophers agree that it's objectively morally wrong. We're not saying it's objectively morally evil because our friends have told us. We're not saying it's objectively morally evil because we feel it deep down inside. It's a objective moral intuition, you know. It's like it's impossible to deny it. This is not what we mean by objective. When we say that morals are real in the sense that they are objective, we're basically saying they are mind independent. Okay. Now, if you have an evolutionary moral realist perspective, you would say they are species independent. Okay. So it's very important to understand this, by the way. So when we say morals are objective, we're not saying, oh, you know, we adopt a humanist approach as a moral philosophy that human beings come together, some kind of consensus, and we say that this is objectively morally wrong. And those ideas are based on our kind of social climate, our liberal social climate, and it's based on our kind of psychological intuitions. No. That's not what objective means here. Objective means morals are mind independent. They're not based on an individual's mind or personal feelings. From an evolutionary moral realist point of view, moral values or moral properties are species independent. They're not dependent on the kind of evolutionary conditions that helped emerge a particular species, okay? Rather, they are species independent. They are based on kind of deep structural features in environments that are based on, that are social and cooperative, that within that emerge species that are social and cooperative. Just to rephrase that, from an evolutionary moral realist point of view, the evolutionary moral realist basically argues that moral properties or moral values are species independent. They're not based on the kind of biological conditions that help emerge a particular species, but rather they're species independent. They're based on deep biological, natural structural features that helped emerge various species that are social and intelligent. So from this perspective, moral values are not dependent on one's mind or personal feelings, just like mathematical truths. For example, 1 + 1 is going to be 2, irrespective of my own personal intellectual judgment, irrespective of my personal feelings about the matter. You know, with all due respect, I might not even like the idea that 1 + 1 is equal to 2, right? I might not like mathematics at all, but irrespective of my personal feelings, 1 + 1 is always going to be 2, whether I like it or not. And even if my mind for some reason says 1 + 1 is equal to 11, you know, no matter how much I try to fudge the logic here, at the end of the day, 1 + 1 is always going to equal to 2. So the mathematical truth of 1 + 1 is equal to 2 is independent of my mind and is independent of my personal feelings. And just like scientific truths, for example, you know, the Earth going around the sun, these are true regardless of what we feel about them. You know, we may wake up one day and we may think that actually it's the other way around. I believe the sun is going around the Earth, but that feeling does nothing to change the truth that actually the Earth is going around the sun. Also, we may try and have a different perspective concerning, you know, the cosmological picture. We might think that in actual fact, I've got some kind of quasi-intellectual evidence that shows that the sun is going around the Earth, irrespective of my dodgy logic in my mind. It's still a scientific truth that the Earth is going around the sun. So from this perspective, morality is not dependent on individual mind or personal feelings. So they're outside ourselves, so to speak. The objective moral values and truths are independent to the individual. They exist within the cosmos, and they're not contingent or dependent on individuals' mind or personal feelings. So this is why we could raise the moral ontological questions, or we should raise the moral ontological questions, the meta-ethical questions. We should ask, well, where did they come from? If justice exists out there in the world, if compassion exists out there in the world, if these moral values and properties exist out there in the world, well, number one, where did they come from? And number two, what explains their nature? What explains the objective nature? In other words, what explains that they are mind independent? What explains that they are species independent? We need to answer these questions. And these questions would help us formulate a ontological foundation to these moral properties and values. Okay? So we now know what is objective. Before we get into the crux of the argument here, it's very important to understand something about moral ontology or metaethics. One would argue, well, Hamza, do we have proof for objective moral values? Well, do you need proof? That's the question, because this idea is based on first principles. This idea is based on the wider domain of knowledge called metaphysics, and within that you have metaethics or moral ontology. So in metaphysics or metaethics, it's basically the kind of philosophy of first principles. So based on our philosophical intuitions and perception of phenomena, perception of the real world, I'm not just saying the observed world, but the unobserved world, like ideas and concepts and values, we can come to the conclusion that there are objective moral truths. Maybe not all of the values that we've come up with, maybe not all of the moral properties that we understand, maybe not all of them are objectively not all of them are objectively moral or objective, but at least some of them are. So we could say as a first principle, as the starting point, that we have good reason in terms of good intuitions to ground the idea that yes, some morals are objective. Okay, so take the example I gave to you previously about deliberately snipping a patient's spinal cord without any justification, medical justification. We have strong moral intuitions that basically tell us that's objectively morally wrong. No matter what someone says about this, even if they try to justify it, it's morally wrong. In any universe, it's morally wrong. In any other kind of scenario, it's morally wrong. If it was deliberate and unjustified, snipping a patient's spinal cord is always going to be morally wrong, irrespective if the whole universe came together and said, no, it's right. So this is our strong intuitions about these moral truths and properties, right? So we would say this is objectively morally wrong. So the question we would ask is, well, why is snipping a patient's spinal cord in this way morally wrong, regardless of personal feelings or opinions? Because they are objective, they are mind independent in that sense. And we could adopt this as the first principle, as a philosophical axiom, if you like, a concept that we adopt that doesn't require any evidence in terms of, doesn't require any further justification or detailed justification, just like many other axioms and assumptions that we adopt in all domains of knowledge. For example, even in science, we have philosophical assumptions that we cannot prove empirically, like that effects have causes, and that there is a causal link. We can't see the causal connection, right? We could see effects, we could see causes, but we can't see the causal connection, the causal link, the causal relation. We have to adopt that as an assumption. We also have to adopt that the real world is the real world. It's external to our minds. We also have to adopt that nature is uniform. This is a non-negotiable philosophical assumption that science has to adopt. Otherwise, you can't have scientific knowledge. So from this perspective, every domain of knowledge has first principles. Every domain of knowledge has these first principles that do not require any further justification. So when you say, do you have proof that objective moral values exist? No. Not in the sense that maybe the questioner is asking this question. But is it coherent? Yes, because it makes sense of our moral intuitions. And we need to ground these intuitions, and then we formulate first principles. Metaphysical, meta-ethical first principles. Objective moral values exist. If they exist, then there are some implications for the atheist and the theist. Now, someone may want to deny the fact that there are objective moral values and truths. No problem. But this is a double-edged sword for them, something we're going to discuss in a few moments, inshallah. Again, before going to the crux of the argument concerning this moral argument that if objective moral values and properties exist, therefore God exists, it's very important to be intellectually fair, intellectually honest, and briefly talk about the varying Islamic perspectives on this issue. Now, as you may be aware, there are different schools of creed in the Islamic tradition. You have the Ash'ari creed, you have the Maturidi creed, and you have the Athari creed. Now, to be very honest with you, when you study these different creeds, they're not a monolith, especially the Ash'ari tradition. You have the early Ash'arites and the later Ash'arites. And there are differences with regards to certain aspects in their theology. So I don't want to get into that for now because this is not a lesson on Islamic creed per se, but I just want to give you an idea on the different perspectives and the perspective that I will be adopting for this webinar. So the Ash'ari perspective, generally speaking, and yes, I'm not saying that the Ash'ari creed is a monolith, of course not, but generally speaking, the Ash'ari creed can be summarized in the following way concerning objective moral values and properties. They basically deny this. They say, no, there is nothing in the real world that is considered objectively moral. And what the Ash'arites focus on is really God's power, God's omnipotence. And they basically focus on it from the perspective that they say, well, when Allah commands something, it's not subject to anything. So Allah therefore can command theft being good. And by virtue of that, since He commanded it, then theft could be good. So there is nothing in the universe that we should consider as objectively morally good or objectively morally evil. Okay? There is nothing. It's just based on your mind. It's based on your nafs, almost, yeah? And this is why the Ash'ari perspective says the human intellect cannot discover moral values independent of revelation. This is the general gist of the Ash'ari creed concerning moral ontology. So just to summarize, there is nothing in the real world that is, with regards to morality, that is mind independent. From the perspective that in the cosmos, you don't have these properties and values, moral properties and values that are mind independent, that they are objective. And that what is good is only what God commands, okay? And God's commands, though, are not subject to anything. So they argue in some kind of sense that God's commands are arbitrary to the divine will. And the divine will is not He is Allah, so this is not a problem. There is a subtlety here, and we're going to address this further when we talk about Yusuf's dilemma, because this perspective, in a way, dislocates God's commands away from God's nature. Okay? And this is something we'll discuss a little later. Now, the Maturidi position is, from an ontological perspective, it's just like the Ash'ari position. So there's nothing in the real world that is considered objectively moral. There are no mind-independent moral properties and moral values. And that God's omnipotence is not subject to anything. He's all-powerful. And when He commands, His commands are subject, obviously, to His will, because His commands are based on His irada, his will and his qudra and his power. But those things are not subject to anything else. So therefore, Allah can command theft being good, for example. However, what they do say though is that the human intellect can discover some moral values independent of revelation. Okay. However, they argue that this would only occur by Allah creating that knowledge in the person's intellect. Okay. So the human intellect can discover some moral values independent of revelation, which is really more of a moral epistemological question, not an ontological question, because it's saying that the human mind can understand what is right and wrong independent of revelation, but that is based on the fact that Allah created that knowledge in the servant's intellect in the first place. Yeah. So this is moving away from the kind of ontological discussion we're having to an epistemological one, but it's still interesting to note that that is the Maturidi position. So the Athari position which is very similar to maybe classical reformed positions in the Christian tradition, where the Athari perspective is that yes, there are objective moral values in the real world. There are moral values that are mind independent, and the human intellect can discover these moral values. So, and obviously because the fitrah, the innate disposition, directs that person with the use of the qalb, the use of the aql, the use of the intellect, and the intellect, the aql is the function of the qalb, and the fitrah directs these to come to the conclusion that there are what is good and what is bad to a certain degree. Not everything, but to a certain, like maybe some basic moral values. So just to repeat, the Athari position is that there are some objective moral values in the real world, meaning that there are moral values and properties like justice exists and compassion exists, and that's outside of the human intellect. That's mind independent rather. And also the human mind, the human intellect can discover these moral values. Maybe not all of them, but it can discover some of these moral values and properties, right? And this obviously is based on the fitrah, which directs the human being. It's like an affinity that directs the human being with the use of the aql, and the aql is inside the qalb, it's a function of the qalb, the intellect, which is a function of the spiritual heart, and the fitrah, the innate disposition, is directing these to understand what some moral values are. Now, what's interesting is that, yes, these objective moral values are based on the divine command. So you may argue, well, what is the difference between the Ashari perspective and the Athari perspective? Well, there is a subtle difference in my view. The subtle difference is that when the Atharis argue that there are objective moral values, or there are moral values in the real world that are mind independent, for example, if the whole universe came together and said that shirk was good, it would still be bad, right? Now, they would argue that, yes, it's based on God's commands, and his commands are based on his irada, his power, his will, and his qudra, and his power. But his will and power are a derivative of his nature. So they're not dislocated away from his nature, because who is Allah? Allah is Al-Bar. He is the source of all goodness. He is the only deity worthy of worship, and the only deity worthy of worship is the most perfect being. So he's the most perfect moral being. So it would not be the case that the Creator will command evil. And this, as the Atharis would say, is in line with the Quranic discourse. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says that Allah does not command immorality. And when you look at Allah's names and attributes, when you start to understand the nature of the divine, you see the nature of the divine is perfect, maximally perfect. And he's Al-Bar, he's the source of all goodness. Also, when the Quran talks to the Quraysh, the polytheistic Arabs, Allah refers to things like compassion and justice, but doesn't really define them. There is a kind of divine assumption here that the polytheists that Allah is talking to understand some of these moral values and properties independent of revelation. So putting all of this together, I think, you know, the Athari position, in my view, is the strongest position concerning moral ontology. But, you know, these discussions are going to continue into the day of judgment. But I think it's very important for you to understand that's the kind of position that's being adopted in this webinar in order for you to appreciate the rest of the webinar. And obviously, I haven't given a full account of the Ash'ari perspective or the Maturidi perspective. Maybe we could do that. We could do maybe comparative Islamic theology on this issue in the future. So yeah, so I don't want to basically develop a straw man or misrepresent, you know, any position. And obviously, you have to really understand, especially when it comes to the Ash'ari perspective, it's not a monolith. There are different accounts on certain issues within the school of creed itself. So, moving forward. Well, actually, this is a very good point, which really substantiates the kind of Athari position. So, take the concept of shirk as an example. So, we would say that shirk is morally wrong. Allah says it's the greatest, it's the greatest sin. It's a great injustice. Okay. So, let's ask the question: is shirk being morally wrong mind independent? Meaning, if the whole world came together and said shirk is good, it would still be bad, right? Okay, good. So if shirk is morally wrong, then let's focus on its opposite, which is tawheed. So we have a command to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? So if Allah commands us to worship Him alone, then is that command arbitrary? Could we say Allah could command us to worship other than Him? Na'udhu billah. And this raises another further question. Is there something about Allah's nature, God's nature, that makes shirk morally wrong? Of course, it's not just an arbitrary command based on this kind of absolute divine power. No, because Allah's commands are based on His irada and qudra, His power and His will and power. And those things are based on Allah's nature. So is there something about Allah's nature that makes shirk morally wrong? Of course. Because Allah is the only deity worthy of worship. Allah makes it very clear in chapter 20, verse 14. It is truly I am Allah. There is no deity worthy of worship except me. So worship me alone and establish prayer for my remembrance. The fact that Allah is worthy of worship is a necessary aspect of His existence. We worship Allah by virtue of who He is, because of who He is. And again, just to repeat, in chapter 31, verse 13, Allah says, indeed, associating partners with Allah is a great injustice. When Allah is talking about what Luqman alayhi salam said to his son, associating partners with Allah is a great injustice. Are we saying that is just based on Allah's command in an arbitrary sense? That it's based on this kind of absolute divine power that is not subject to divine will, that is subject to His nature? Or we're just saying it's an absolute divine power that's subject to His will, but His will is not subject to anything to do with who Allah is? So the Athari position would say, no, hold on a second, you know, shirk is morally wrong. It's mind independent that is morally wrong. It's the greatest sin and injustice, no matter what anyone says. And it's not just an arbitrary command that shirk is morally wrong. And conversely, it's not an arbitrary command that it's morally good to worship Allah. It's not just based on an abstract, arbitrary divine command, but rather there's something about Allah's nature that makes shirk morally wrong and makes tawheed morally good. So when Allah commands tawheed, worshipping Him, that command is based on His will, that's in line with who He is, because Allah is the only deity worthy of worship. And when Allah commands that we should not do shirk, that we should not associate partners with Allah, that's not based on an arbitrary divine command, based on this kind of absolute idea of divine omnipotence, but rather, yes, Allah can do whatever He wills, but what He wills is in line with His nature. And since Allah is the only being worthy of worship, He would not command us to associate partners with him. So there is a subtle difference between the Ash'ari position and the Maturidi position and the Athari position. Yes, we agree. Morals are based on divine commands, but divine commands are not arbitrary. They're not dislocated from the divine nature. And hopefully, I've tried to articulate this case by using the ideas of Tawheed and Shirk as an example. So let's now go to discuss an argument for God. It's a very simple argument. It's an axiomatic argument, meaning we start with a philosophical assumption, a philosophical first principle, which we discussed earlier. So we start with the fact that objective morals exist. So if objective morals exist, God must exist. Objective morals exist, therefore God exists. This is a axiomatic argument. Let's just repeat. Premise number one, if objective morals exist, God must exist. Premise number two, objective morals exist. Objective moral values and properties exist. Conclusion, therefore God exists. So let's unpack this. So why? Why are we saying God must exist if there are objective morals? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God provides this foundation for objective morals because why? Number one, He's external to the universe and He transcends human subjectivity. He is the objective source and His commands are not subjective from the point of view, they're not based on any limitation external to Him. Nothing external to Allah limits Him. So He is an objective source and He's maximally perfect, meaning His names and attributes are to the highest degree possible. They have no deficiency and no flaw. Allah is objective. Allah is external to the universe. He transcends human subjectivity. He can make the universal moral claim. Allah has the totality of knowledge and wisdom. Allah has the picture. We just have a pixel. As the Professor Ian Markham explains, God explains the mysterious ought pressing down our lives. And God explains the universal nature of the moral claim. As God is outside of the world, God the Creator can both be external and make universal commands. So the reason that we can say that if objective moral values and properties exist, God must exist, because you remember, objective moral properties are mind independent. They're not based on human subjectivity. So what is the kind of concept, the most coherent concept, if you like, or the most coherent reality that provides a foundation for these objective morals? It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the two ontological questions are answered, the two meta-ethical questions are answered. Number one, where did these objective morals come from? Number two, what explains their nature? What explains that they are mind independent? Allah is external to the universe and Allah is objective. Allah is not limited by anything external to Him. Allah can make universal moral claim. So Allah as a reality answers those two questions. Where do morals come from? Allah, His commands. How does that explain the fact that objective morals are mind independent? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is external to the universe and He makes the universal moral claim and He's not subjective. Khalas, it answers these two moral ontological questions, the meta-ethical questions. So if objective moral values exist, we know we need some meta-ethical moral ontological questions answered, and those questions are answered by the divine reality, the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, He makes a universal command, He is the objective source of morality, and He is not subjective, He's external to the universe, and He can make the universal moral claim. And this is why when we understand what Allah says about Himself and we understand Islamic theology, then it all makes perfect sense. Because remember, Allah is maximally perfect. This means His names and attributes are to the highest degree possible. They have no deficiency and no flaw. So He has maximal knowledge. He's maximal knowledgeable, powerful and good. Perfect goodness is Allah's nature, al-bar. This is what it means, the source of all knowledge, the good, if you like. And al-bar here is perfect, without any deficiency and any flaw. He's the perfect moral being. So when Allah makes a command, it's a derivative of His will, and His will does not contradict His nature from this perspective. So therefore, what Allah commands is good because He is good. And He defines what good is. Allah says in the Quran in chapter 7, verse 28, say, indeed, Allah does not order, does not command immorality. And this is very important to understand, because this statement here, you're not going to interpret this statement in an anti-intuitive way. You're not going to say, well, Allah doesn't order immorality because what Allah orders is moral. No, that's the case too, but there's also something outside of our minds in this cosmos that points towards certain objective moral values and properties like justice and compassion. So Allah is pointing to us. He's pointing to a direction that's outside of ourselves. And He's saying, look, you have these intuitive first principle notions of what is objectively good and bad. Right? You might not have the full moral picture, but there are some things, even if it's one objective moral, even if it's one, that's enough for this argument to be coherent. So if you agree there are objective moral values and properties that are such as justice and compassion, then yes, Allah does not order immorality, meaning Allah does not order injustice. Allah doesn't order things that are malicious or the antithesis to compassion, right? And that's not only because Allah because it is Allah who's ordering them, but it's also because there's something outside of our minds that we can appreciate that exists in this moral universe that we can consider as objectively moral. And those objective morals exist because of the commands of God, and they are objective because Allah makes them so because of who He is. So an interesting contention to this argument is what you would call Euthyphro's dilemma. So Plato articulated this, and he put it in the form of Euthyphro's dilemma, what is known as Euthyphro's dilemma. So what is the dilemma? Basically, it's articulated in the following way. Is something morally good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's morally good? Okay, so intuitively here we're stuck, because if it's good because it's defined by God's commands, then what does that mean? It means good and evil are arbitrary because God could command anything. There's nothing in the real world that we should consider objectively wrong or objectively good. And this is called the arbitrariness horn, right? The two horns of the dilemma. So just repeat. Is it morally good because God commands it? That's the first horn of the dilemma. Well, if that's the case, if morality is defined by God's commands, then it's arbitrary, because God could say, kill everyone over the age of 50. And there's nothing in the universe that we should consider as objectively wrong or objectively good. If you take the other horn of the dilemma, which is called the independent standard horn, if you like, which is, or does God command it because it is morally good, then what happens here? This now means that morality is external to God. Morality is external to God's commands, because we're saying, well, God commands it because it's morally good. Well, if it's morally good, then you don't need God's commands anymore, because morality now is external to God's commands. You already know what good is. You don't need His commands because you're describing His commands as good. So moral standards from this point of view are completely outside and independent of God's essence and nature. Therefore, Allah is not required for objective morals. So if you take either of these, then you have a major problem. Then you can't articulate this argument. So obviously the Asha'ira and the Maturidis, they take the arbitrariness horn. They just basically, what do you call it? They bit the bullet, right? They bit the bullet, right? And they said, that's it. It's arbitrary, based on Allah's commands. Allah could command anything based on, this kind of divine omnipotence that's not based on His nature. He just commands in that sense. However, one would argue here that yes, it's based on God's commands, but why? And this is where we expose Euthyphro's dilemma as a false dilemma, because there's not only two options. Because for a dilemma to be a dilemma, there's only two options. But we could give you a third option, okay? A third possibility, that Allah is good, okay? As Professor of Philosophy Shabir Akhtar in the Quran and the Secular Mind, he says, no, there is a third alternative. A morally stable God of the kind found in Scripture, a supreme being who would not arbitrarily change his mind about the goodness of compassion and the evil of sexual misconduct. Such a God always commands good because his character and nature are good. Now, this is very interesting because from what I understand, and I may be wrong, and please get back to me if I am wrong, Professor Shabir Akhtar, who's a great mind, he, I think, adopts a kind of Ash'ari position on these issues. And that's why it's very interesting that I mentioned earlier that the Ash'ari creed is not a monolith. There are differences even maybe amongst these discussions, okay? So there is a third option. It's not a dilemma, it's a forced dilemma because it is based on God's commands, but it's because Allah is good. It's not arbitrary, so his commands are not dislocated away from the divine nature. So let's explain this a little bit further. So we would say, yes, there is a moral standard, but unlike what the second horn suggests, it's not external to God, right? Rather, it follows necessarily from Allah's nature. His nature contains with it the perfect, non-arbitrary moral standard. Because Allah is Al-Bar, He is the source of all goodness. This means that an individual's actions, for example, the killing of innocents, is not arbitrarily bad. It's actually objectively bad because it follows from an objective, necessary moral standard. And on the other hand, it does not mean that God is somehow subservient to this standard because it's contained in His nature because He is good. It defines His nature. It is not in any way external to Him. So this is very important to understand. So let's understand this third option. So we're not saying it's good because God commanded it and God's commands are arbitrary. And we're not saying it's good because the commands of God are good. One horn of the dilemma basically says that it's arbitrary. There should be nothing in the universe that you consider good or evil, objectively good and evil. It's just based on arbitrary divine commands. And the other part of the horn, the other horn of the dilemma basically says, well, the commands of God are good. Well, what you've done now, you've made good external to Him. The way to break this dilemma and to pull the horns apart and to provide a third alternative is to say it's based on His commands, but His commands are not dislocated away from His nature. They are in line with His nature because Allah is good. And His goodness is not arbitrary. It's the highest moral standard. Remember, Allah has perfect goodness because His names and attributes are perfect. They're maximally perfect with no deficiency and no flaw. And Allah is objective, is external to the universe. So Allah can make an objective moral standard. Okay? And at the same time, that moral standard is not external to Him because it defines His nature because He is Al-Bar, He is the source of all goodness. And His commands are not arbitrary because it's in line with His nature. And this solves the dilemma. Now, a natural response would be, atheists would argue this, well, you must know what good is to define God as good. And therefore, you haven't really solved the problem. Well, the simple reply is, well, you haven't really listened to anything we're saying. God defines what good is because He is the most perfect being. He's the only being worthy of worship because He's the most perfect and moral being. And the only being worthy of worship is the most perfect and moral being. This is a coherent perspective. It's a coherent meta-ethical concept that answers the two meta-ethical or moral ontological questions. Where did these objective morals come from and what explains the objective nature? This is a coherent meta-ethic. Now you could keep on asking these questions ad infinitum, but you're missing the point. There needs to be a metaphysical stopping point. You need to have a metaphysical, meta-ethical stopping point. Now, give me an alternative. What are the atheistic alternatives to answer the meta-ethical or moral ontological questions concerning objective moral truth? What are the alternatives? Are they more coherent than this alternative? No, they're not. So unless you're willing to be a moral nihilist, unless you're willing to say that morality is subjective, which would have huge implications in atheist discourse, then you need to appreciate that the divine reality is a coherent reality, coherent concept that is a metaphysical, a meta-ethical construct, first principle that answers the two main questions. Number one, where did these objective morals come from? And number two, what explains their mind-independent nature? What is your alternative? Remember, just because you could keep on asking the questions ad infinitum, it doesn't mean your metaphysical, meta-ethical principle or answer is not coherent. You have to have a stopping point. So the question here is, what's your alternative? You either become a moral nihilist, or you believe morals are subjective, or you have a meta-ethical explanation that is far more coherent than our explanation here concerning God. And when we explore them, you don't have anything to stand on. For example, let's talk about these main alternatives: biology, social pressure, and moral realism. Well, let's talk about biology. Well, what did Charles Darwin say? He even questioned this issue. If objective morals were as a result of biological conditions, then we're in big trouble. Because what did Charles Darwin say? He said, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Because if we were reared under precisely the same conditions, and raping and killing and all of these things would be fine according to this paradigm. Well, at least in this context, killing fertile daughters would be fine, we're morally okay. Now, if you protract and extend what Charles Darwin said, let's apply this to the nurse shark. According to National Geographic, the nurse shark bites the fin of its mate and wrestles with its mate before it actually engages in the biological act of mating. This is tantamount to rape. So if we were reared under precisely the same conditions as the nurse shark, we would think it's morally okay to rape women. So what does it mean when we say biology or evolution is the basis for objective moral values and properties? Well, it doesn't mean anything, because you lose any moral meaning, because the only moral meaning you have is, well, it just happened to be based on random naturalistic causes via natural selection that we were reared under these conditions. Okay, there's nothing necessary about those conditions. We could have been reared under other conditions. So there's no moral meaning. The meaningfulness behind this objective moral value and property is gone. Also, it's not mind independent. So it can't be objective, because if our moral properties and values such as justice and compassion is just based on our minds, or just based on the biological conditions where our minds emerged or where our species emerged, then by definition it's not objective anymore, because for it to be objective, it has to be species independent or mind independent. So it's just subject to biological conditions that shape the evolution of our species. So there's nothing objective here. So this alternative is wrong. Now, one would argue, fine, it's not evolution, but it's natural selection. Look, natural selection is an evolutionary mechanism. In natural selection, all it can do is give you the capacity to formulate ethical rules. It doesn't provide a foundation for objective morals. There's a subtle difference. And that's why the ethicist Philip Kitcher, I believe his name is, he basically says that all natural selection can do is provide you or help you or develop within you the capacity to formulate ethical rules, and not the foundation for objective moral values or properties. What about social pressure? Well, let's look at social pressure. Let's look at what's happening with the Uyghurs in China: torture, death camps, genocide, systematic attempt to destroy Uyghur culture, mass sterilization, forced abortions, and mandatory birth control. There seems to be some kind of quasi-consensus, some social pressure. It doesn't have to be 50% or over 50%, but there is some pressure that's saying, you know what, these Uyghurs should be treated this way. If objective moral values and properties are based on social pressure, then we're in big trouble, because societies change over time based on so many different aspects. Just study social psychology, just study politics, just study the ways societies are structured, study conformity and influence. You will see that societies are taking on this kind of moral journey. Just compare some of our moral outlook 40 years ago with today, 30 years ago and today. What about Nazi Germany? One would argue there was a quasi-consensus. It doesn't have to be 100%. Say it was 40%, 50%. There was a social pressure to think that Jewish people should be exterminated, and that's what happened. If you think social pressure becomes the basis for your moral outlook, the basis for objective moral values and properties, then you need to be consistent. You should say that what happened in Nazi Germany is morally okay. But no one would say that. It would be a great evil to say such a thing. What about moral realism? You know, there are many ethicists and moral philosophers that say, well, look, we don't have to ground morality in anything. We could just say that morals are just real. They are mind independent, they are objective, and they just exist. Well, there's a big problem here. The ontological questions we raised in the beginning are not really answered. How can you say justice just exists, compassion just exists, they're mind independent, and they just are? Because we have to ask the question, where do they come from? What explains the objective nature? What explains the fact that they are mind independent? I think it's a bit of a cop-out. You can't just say, oh, you know, justice just exists and compassion just exists. And remember, there's something important that we haven't mentioned yet, but it's important to mention it now. Remember, morality is not just limited to recognizing the truth of compassion or justice. Remember, morality is about the ought. What did Professor Ian Markham say? There's a pressing ought on our lives. We ought to do good. We ought to behave. We ought to be just. We ought to be kind. There's a certain moral obligation or moral duty. We are obligated to be compassionate and just. Now, what's very interesting, under moral realism, such obligations are impossible. Because remember, if I just recognize intellectually that justice is an objective moral value and property, okay, and it exists, that intellectual realization does nothing to make me obligated to follow that moral truth or that moral property or value. Why? Because moral duties are owed. However, who do we owe them to? And when we talk about the divine, it makes more sense because we owe Allah. We are obligated. We are obligated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are duty bound. And these duties are owed to whom? Allah. But under moral realism, who they're owed to? No one. It doesn't follow that recognizing an objective moral truth now means you're obligated to follow that moral truth, or recognize a moral value or property now means you're obligated to follow a moral value or property. It doesn't work that way. There's that obligation, that sense of obligation, that sense of owing a duty doesn't make sense under moral realism, but it makes sense under the divine reality because you have a relation with the divine. We owe you Allah. We are obligated to you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, there are certain contentions concerning this argument. You know, one would argue, well, Hamza, this is not making sense to me because aren't there certain situations where killing becomes morally permissible, such as defending oneself and family? Therefore, there's nothing objectively evil. Now, there is a problem with this understanding because it's a conflation between two different concepts here. It's conflating absolute morality with objective morality. So what is absolute morality? Absolute morality basically says that a moral act is good or bad irrespective of the situation. So killing is always going to be morally evil. Objective morality, though, is not the same as absolute morality. It says, look, we understand there are morally context-sensitive situations. We understand there are moral variables. So it wouldn't be an objective moral truth or an objective moral fact to say that killing is morally wrong. No, because sometimes in certain moral contexts, killing becomes morally good. For example, if you saw a mad, crazy person indiscriminately shooting thousands of children, 5-year-olds in a school, and the only way you could stop this individual is by pulling the trigger. The only way, right? So the only legal, moral way that you could stop this individual is by pulling the trigger. Doing so would become morally good. That's the point. So there are moral variables to consider. So there's a difference between saying absolute morality and objective morality. Absolute morality would say killing is always wrong, irrespective of the situation. Objective morality would be killing innocent human beings without appropriate justification is wrong. So you see there is a context-sensitive nature here. We're saying innocent and without justification. That's the moral context. Now, remember what I said when we talked about Euthyphro's dilemma, needing a stopping point, and what is your alternative? At this point, and I've heard this a lot, and you know, many atheists actually articulate this to say, well, there are no objective moral truths. Well, that's a double-edged sword. Fine, reject it. What are the implications here? Denying objective morals means that you have no right to point the finger at religion, more specifically Islam, in any objective way. How can you even point the finger at the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, or ISIS, or even the dictatorship of North Korea? How can you point the finger in an objective way? You rejected objective morals. You should put a caveat to all of your moral judgments and say, this is my subjective view. It's subject to my understanding. And this is why really it renders all of the moral disagreements against religion as pointless, or the kind of moral outrage. How dare you say things? How dare you believe in this? Well, hold on a second. If you reject objective morality, it's just subjective. It's not mind independent. It's dependent on your individual understanding and your feelings. You're just sentimental about the whole thing. So what gives you the right to point the finger in that kind of objective way? But that being said, it's very important to understand that deep down inside, most sane human beings do not deny the objectivity of some basic morals, such as murder, theft, and abuse. And this whole argument is not dependent on believing that all objective values and properties are objective. It doesn't mean that you have to believe that all morals are objective. No. Even if one moral is objective, this argument makes sense. So these are the implications for the atheist. Now, let's quickly talk about moral epistemology. So we said there was a difference between moral ontology and moral epistemology. And moral epistemology doesn't really talk about the kind of nature of morality. It talks about what is good. How do we know what is good? And it doesn't talk about the source of morals or their nature in terms of what explains their mind-independent nature. This is not really a moral epistemological question, but rather moral epistemology is moral knowledge. How do we get to know what is good and bad? So interestingly, with this argument, since the ontological basis for objective morals are God's commands, therefore we should be kind of motivated to find out what his commands are. And that would facilitate knowledge, because there is a kind of link, if you like, between moral metaethics, moral ontology, and moral epistemology. And what is that link? Well, since objective morals are based on God's commands, then let's find out what they are. And now, obviously I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, but just to encourage further thinking and research, what does Allah say? Essentially, the Quran and the Sunnah and the prophetic traditions are the source of our morality, to understand what is morally good and morally bad. And you could develop the maqasid of the Sharia, the higher principles or intent of Islamic law, for example, which include preservation of religion, preservation of life, preservation of wealth, preservation of the mind, preservation of lineage and honor. And Allah says in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 216, and it may be that you dislike a thing which is good for you and that you like a thing which is bad for you. Allah knows and you do not. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that you will never know external to revelation, because, you know, especially according to the Maturidi perspective and the Athari perspective, that you can use your intellect, or which is really guided by your fitra, guided by your innate disposition, to allow you to understand what is good and what is bad, which is really assumed in the Quran and Sunnah anyway, when Allah is talking to the Quraysh, the polytheistic Arabs, in a way that they have an appreciation on what is just and what is compassion, independent to revelation, right? And I think the Maturidi stance makes a really interesting point. They say, well, you know, the mind which is being created by Allah, and that knowledge in the mind which is being created by Allah, comes to at least the understanding that truth is important. Because that's why we believe people when they give the shahada, right? Or affirming the truth, right? Because at the point where someone wants to take the shahada, you know, surely there's some kind of moral, they feel morally obligated to follow the truth, right? So you're not going to accept people's shahada? Of course you are. So also, this doesn't mean that Allah knows and we do not know that we can't, you know, come to some moral conclusions of independent revelation. Of course we can, and we know this is assumed in the Quranic discourse itself. But the main point of this verse is to make us realize that fundamentally the total moral picture in terms of how to know what is good and bad comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So last few minutes, let's talk about evolutionary moral realism. Now, what's very interesting, brothers and sisters and friends, that this book that's come out it came out in 2020. It was by John Collier and Michael Stingle, and it's called Evolutionary Moral Realism. Okay, Evolutionary Moral Realism. Now, we already discussed, for instance, biology. The biology as a moral ontological foundation for objective moral truths is incoherent. Okay, so but this is like an expression of that, but in a more detailed way. And I'm just going to summarize it for you here, because I had to do a research paper on this issue for my research studies, for my postgraduate research studies. I'm going to publish this this paper in the future, inshallah. But let's just talk about what they really talk about, okay? So John Collier and Michael Stingle, they basically theorize that moral values are a real part of the biological world, whether or not animals are able to perceive them, okay? And what's their main empirical hypothesis? It's an empirical hypothesis, okay? They say that moral values or moral properties are biological, and they exist as deep structural features of environments that involve social and intelligent organisms, okay? But they are species independent because they exist in those structural features that give rise to these social and intelligent organisms, okay? And this is why they say that moral values are not non-natural, like they can't come from the divine, because they're embedded in forms of cooperation that led to evolution of human intelligence. And that itself was based on deep structural features of environments that facilitate social and intelligent organisms, okay? Obviously, they're saying it's just a plausible hypothesis, as they say themselves, the initial plausibility and theoretical interest. It needs further arguments, and it requires more empirical development. However, let's break down their argument, because they're basically saying that objective moral properties are species independent from the point of view that they exist as deep structural features of natural environments that will emerge social and intelligent organisms, okay? So I'm not going to talk about why that doesn't make sense in terms of providing the answers that are required from a more ontological point of view, because that's already addressed when we talked about the biology aspect, the biology as an alternative. But I just want to focus on, even if you were to say that is true, which is not, even if you were to say that's true, evolutionary moral realism undermines truth. And here's the basic structure of the argument. Number one, evolutionary moral realism postulates that morals emerge from structural features of cooperative environments of species that are both intelligent and social. Number two, cooperative environments are developed through storytelling. Number three, storytelling requires truth and fiction. Number four, truth being intrinsically valuable is a moral good. Number five, cooperation which requires truth and fiction diminishes truth being intrinsically valuable. Six, evolutionary moral realism cannot account for truth as a moral value. 7, truth as a moral value is undermined by EMR, evolutionary moral realism. Okay, so how do we unpack this? Now, there's the paper I wrote was, I think, is over 5,000 words, so I can't there's only so much I can summarize, but it's very important to say, look, let's take premise one as a given, because if you read the work, that's what they say. Morals emerge from structural features of cooperative environments that are both intelligent and social, and they say, therefore, moral values are species independent from that point of view because it's based on those structural features. However, corporate environments are very important for EMR, for evolution moral realism. But interestingly, corporate environments, if you study the philosophy of biology, and I can't go into all the references now, but I will publish this in the future, corporate environments are developed through storytelling. And interestingly, storytelling requires truth and fiction, especially in our hominid ancestry. It requires truth and fiction. Remember this. So look, let's follow. Corporate environments are very important for EMR, evolution moral realism. However, corporate environments are developed through storytelling. So you can read the works of Boyd, Lee, and others, and you just see that's the case. This is the picture, the picture in philosophy of biology. Okay, you can read the works of Joyce, Nowak, and others. Okay, so cooperation is very important, but in order to cooperate, you require storytelling. So storytelling has been shown to be a key factor in ensuring that cooperation takes place. So you can read the works of Beatty, Tilston, and Bangerter. You can read also the works of Brian Boyd again, Lee, and so on and so forth. So storytelling is very important in order to ensure cooperation. But storytelling is not just about telling the truth. It requires truth and fiction. So there was a famous study that supported this idea about fictional storytelling, and it's the study of hunter-gatherers. And it was the study was done by Daniel Smith, Philip Schlaffer, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Katie Major, and others. And they basically concluded that basically they used the elders from the actor community in the Philippines, and they came to the conclusion that fictional storytelling was very important for promoting cooperation. Now, if that's the case, that you need cooperation, and cooperation requires storytelling, and that requires truth and fiction, then, well, what does that do to truth? Well, firstly, let's try and justify if truth is intrinsically valuable. Is it a moral good? So you can read the works of Paul Horwich, you can read the works of Alan Hazlitt, and so on and so forth. But when you read their works, you will come to the conclusion that I came to, that truth is intrinsically valuable. Yes, there are nuances that we should unpack, but generally speaking, especially when it comes to a meta-ethical perspective, we value truth for its own sake, right? Especially when metaphysical and meta-ethical discussions have no instrumental value. They don't increase the price of bread. They don't affect our lives in any crazy way. We are trying to pursue these things for the sake of truth, because we believe truth has an intrinsic value, especially in epistemology. Imagine you didn't believe truth was intrinsically valuable when you're studying knowledge, when you're studying the theories of knowledge, or when you're studying epistemology, or when you're studying meta-ethical truths. If you believe that truth didn't have any intrinsic value, then a means towards the ends. No, because when you're studying ethics, meta-ethics, epistemology, you have to have the assumption that we want to pursue truth and avoid falsehood, and truth has intrinsic value, right? So truth is intrinsically valuable. However, cooperation, which requires truth and fiction, diminishes truth being intrinsically valuable. It diminishes it. Because it could be based on a hominid ancestry that the storytelling was just purely based on fiction. And truth wasn't. So what it's saying here, truth is not necessary. It's an instrument to cooperation. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. Well, if that's the case, and what happens here is therefore evolutionary moral realism cannot account for truth as a moral value. And it's undermined by, and therefore it's undermined. Obviously, there are some potential responses. So Collier and Stenger could basically say, well, fiction facilitates truth. Well, does it? Does it facilitate truth? Is fiction actually a facilitator for truth, and truth now becomes intrinsically valuable? No, that's not the case at all. It's not the case at all, because this is the way we can respond. We could respond by saying, well, you know, a hominid storyteller could communicate a story that instructs the group that every time a hustling sound is heard in a particular bush, for example, one must alert the group because it is a poisonous snake. So in doing so, the group, they avoid the illusory poisonous snake. However, the poisonous snake doesn't exist. When the noise is heard, they avoid charging animals that can harm them, because the hustling noise was the result of the vibrations of the ground. Now, even if the noise is not the result of charging animals, they still survive, as avoiding the bush does not lead to harm, and it does not come at a high biological cost. So it's clear that fictional storytelling can lead to survival and cooperation of this issue, and it can be fitness enhancing. It's not the view that fiction actually leads to truth and truth is fitness enhancing. It could be fiction can be fitness enhancing. Also, they could also respond by saying, well, truth is not a moral value. Well, fair enough. Well, this is exactly our point. You know, you can give up. That's fair enough. And another, well, actually, that would be their main response, to be honest. So you see, when biological accounts are expressed further in academia, they are incoherent in some way. And especially in this new book, Evolution Moral Realism, it actually undermines truth as a moral value. But notwithstanding, it also doesn't provide a meta-ethical ontological foundation for objective moral truth, as we discussed in the biology section. Obviously, we'll unpack this further in a future webinar, just specifically on evolutionary moral realism, inshallah. So finally, how does this make sense of the fact that Allah is worthy of worship? So as we said, this makes sense of the fact that God exists, because if objective moral values exist, God must exist. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists. And we've articulated that argument. But it's not just enough that God exists, especially in the Islamic tradition, because it's about understanding that Allah is worthy of worship. Now, as we said previously, Allah's names and attributes are maximally perfect, meaning they have no deficiency and they have no flaw. So since Allah's names and attributes, such as Al-Bar, He's the source of goodness, this name and attribute is to the highest degree possible, has no deficiency and flaw, then therefore He's worthy of extensive praise and gratitude. Because we praise things by virtue of their attributes all the time. We'll praise a soccer player for scoring a great goal. We praise a poet for his eloquence and his rhetoric. We'll praise a martial artist for the ability to have, martial arts skills. We'll praise nasheed artists or singers for their great ability to sing, and so on and so forth. So we praise these things by saying bravo, by saying thank you, by giving a standing ovation, by clapping, by applauding. And we do so by virtue of their attributes, but their attributes do not directly benefit us in any way. And their attributes are deficient and flawed in some way, because they're human beings, they're not perfect. So if we can praise things by virtue of their attributes, then what does it mean about praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whose names and attributes are maximally perfect, without any deficiency, without any flaw? And this is what we covered in detail during the webinar concerning why Allah is worthy of worship. So please access that to go on the website to just recall some of the ideas that we're articulating. So therefore, Allah is worthy of extensive praise and gratitude, because He is the source of all goodness, and Him being the source of all goodness, being Al-Bar, the source of all goodness, requires perfect gratitude or extensive praise, because we know His names and attributes, such as Al-Bar, has no flaw and no deficiency. It's perfect. And therefore, we should extensively praise Him. And extensive praise is a key to worship, as Allah says in the Quran, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All perfect praise and gratitude belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, belong to the Lord of everything that exists. So it shows that praise and gratitude are keys to worship. Also, when you reflect on objective moral values, that should lead us to thank him. Reflect on, for example, the value of truth, the value of justice. Us being given the ability to recognize his moral values is enough to thank him. And gratitude is the key to worship. And this is why this argument can be linked to the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worthy of worship. So, brothers and sisters and friends, questions. Let's have some questions, inshallah. Let's have questions. Just bear with me. Ismail Hussein, bless you, bro. Grant you the best in this life and in the akhirah. Okay, so we know evil is not the same as saying Allah commands evil. There's a fundamental difference. So there's a difference between saying Allah creates good and evil and Allah commands evil. They are not the same thing. Is that clear? If that's not clear, then please let me know. Okay, there's a really interesting question here. One second, let me just scroll. Let me find it. Okay, so Bilal Kharis says, what about utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is a normative ethical theory. This is about moral epistemology, not moral ontology. Our discussion today is about metaethics, moral ontology. Utilitarianism is more referring to epistemology, that we can know what's good and bad based upon the consequences, which is also referred to sometimes as consequentialism, the utility, if you like. You know, does it increase, does it increase benefit? Does it increase the utility, or does it decrease harm, right? This is the kind of approach to morals. And this is why you'd have some atheists, like Professor Lawrence Krauss. He wouldn't outrightly condemn incest, for example, because when he puts his utilitarian calculus on this, people are like, well, is there any harm if a brother and sister actually have contraception and they do it once to just express their love? The harms are not going, there's not going to be any harm from his perspective, because there's contraception, there's not going to be a child with any genetic defects, but the benefits are increased for them because they get to express their love in the way that they want. So he applied that utilitarian calculus to that scenario. Now, obviously, many of us will find that absolutely absurd, because even from a utilitarian point of view, one would argue, well, what about the psychological harm? But even if he's right, you know, intuitively we find that extremely problematic and worrying. And obviously, you know, utilitarianism from this perspective is interesting, to say the least. But obviously, there are conceptual issues with utilitarianism. But this is not the time to discuss that. Maybe the time. Just to answer your question, utilitarianism is about etymologies, how to get to know what is good and what is bad. And our discussion today is about moral ontology. Yes, it's time for Maghrib, Tariq, but I'm in a different country. I'm not in the UK. Actually, Maghrib just came in about, I think, 5 minutes ago or something. So we're going to finish soon, inshallah. Jazakallah here for reminding us. May Allah bless you. Okay, Batur Khan said, if God can only command things derivative of his nature, and his nature is good, he can only command good and therefore cannot command evil. Doesn't this impede us on his omnipotence? Well, it depends what you mean by impeding and what you mean by omnipotence here. And these are huge discussions to have. But we say no, there is no limit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the point of view, nothing external to him limits him, right? Well, take, for example, the omnipotence paradox. Can Allah create a stone that's so heavy that he can't move? If you say yes, then that's a huge problem. But doesn't that impede us on his omnipotence? No, we wouldn't say that because we don't consider Allah's omnipotence in that way. Because you remember, what did Al-Qurtubi, the Mufassir who explained the Quran, he said that when Allah says Allah has power over all things, which means all possibilities. Now, Allah creating a stone he can't move is not a possibility. It's meaningless because Allah is the all-powerful being. So what you're saying in that sentence logically doesn't make sense. You're saying, can an all-powerful being not be an all-powerful being? Well, if he's not all-powerful being, he's not an all-powerful being anymore. So you just contradict yourself in the same sentence, right? So it depends. These are huge things to unpack. You know, from the Athari position, they would just say, look, Allah doesn't command evil. Allah says it. He doesn't command evil. Why does he not command evil? Because what's his nature? His nature is good. Do you see my point? That is not seen as an impediment to his omnipotence, right? It's not seen as an impediment to his omnipotence. But this does really open a huge can of worms about the nature of God's names and attributes and about, you know, are they essential and all of these things? Are they necessary? But that is for another day, another time. And to be honest, it doesn't immensely affect the coherence of this argument articulated today. But just to be intellectually fair and just, that question is a very smart question, but opens a massive theo-philosophical discussion and debate that maybe we can have another time and maybe with other people. Yeah. So may Allah bless you. Okay, just bear with me. I'm just scrolling down the questions. Okay, Batur Khan said, if God defines good, he can define good as whatever he wants. Doesn't this make the concept of good arbitrary? Well, it's not arbitrary from the point of view that the reason God defines good is because he is good. Goodness is part of his nature, so it's not arbitrary. Okay? And the reason he defines good because he is perfectly good. So that doesn't make it arbitrary from that perspective. And we can recognize some aspects of objective goodness. And we could appreciate that they're mind independent. And the reason we have the ability to do that is because we have a fitrah that can direct us to those moral properties and moral values. Okay, Hesham Bhatta says, don't get why storytelling is needed. We're not saying it's needed. We're saying in the philosophy of biology, based on research, that cooperation requires storytelling, and storytelling requires truth and fiction. And what we mean by requires, we're not saying necessarily requires, but it just happened to be that in our hominid ancestry, that the way they expressed stories was with fiction and with falsity and with and with truth. It was both. That's what we're saying. And given that's the fact, then that undermines truth as being intrinsically valuable, because truth and fiction become instrumental for cooperation, and therefore EMR, evolutionary moral realism, undermines truth as a moral value. Okay, very good question. That means you've been really focusing. Awruna Naeem. Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Can you please explain moral realism again? How does that differ from objective morality? Good. You know, that actually was in my head, I think, when I was articulating this. So moral realists, philosophers who believe that there are objective moral truths, actually believe in objective morality. So that's not an issue here. So we're not saying it differs from objective morality per se, or they contradict the idea that they're objective morals. What they are saying is this, is that they don't require answers to the ontological questions, like where did these objective moral values come from and what explains the fact that they're mind independent. They just say they just are. That's the point. And moral realism would contradict divine command theory, or theists such as ourselves who believe that actually morals, objective morals, can only be explained by God's commands, and in our context, and because God's commands are a derivative of His will, and His will is in line with His nature, and His nature is good. He is Al-Bar. Okay, Ahmed Khitir says, what if they deny that intuition is a valid way of recognizing that moral realism is true? Well, let them. Well, if an atheist does that, then he's a moral anti-realist. If he adopts anti-realism, he believes that morals are not objective. So fine. As I said previously, it's a double-edged sword, because if you believe morals are subjective, then yani, it's your opinion. Stop pointing the finger in such an objective way. If aliens exist, do you think that they will have similar objective morals? I don't know, man. I don't know. See, this is interesting. So Jubaira Khatun says, how do we navigate something like slavery within morality and God being good? Well, that would require you to look at the moral variables. And that's something that is actually discussed in the usuli tradition, in the four madhahib, for example. We have a very rich usuli tradition, a tradition that is based on principles that are derived from the Quran and Sunnah. And we have a very detailed judicial process, a jurisprudence that looks at the moral variables. Like, in a way, we're like virtue ethicists, in a way that we just don't look at what happened. We don't look at the act, we look at the why and the how and the what and the context. Yeah. And one way of dealing with that is, we'll navigate the moral variables, the social political variables, the and so on and so forth. And that's why when you want to look into some of these things, you want to look at the more variables, but that doesn't give us an excuse now to say that, oh, we're going to fit our own neoliberal picture on the matter. No, it has to be as done without any baggage, any social, political, social baggage. You know, we have to allow the Quran to speak for itself, and it has to be understood in light of the fact that Allah knows what's truly good for us. Yeah. But when it comes to these things, every time you look at the moral variables, social, political, ethical variables, then you get an answer that is definitely in line with one's fitrah, inshallah. And if not, and in some rare cases that it's not, then it's a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And remember, obeying Allah and passing the test is one of the greatest moral goods anyway. Okay, good. Very good question. So Ilham Rahim says, so morals are objective, right? So basically saying, why do we need Quran and Sunnah? Okay, well, this is very important. So we're saying moral values and properties are objective. So the idea that justice is mind independent. Okay. You need the Quran and Sunnah for number one, to tell you, well, what is justice now in certain political contexts, or sorry, not political, certain social, ethical, political contexts. So there's the idea of moral values and properties, and these are connected to things like moral facts or moral truths. So moral truths are like moral statements. So moral value and property will be like justice exists. Okay, good, we agree with this. The mind can understand this, right? Maybe independent of revelation, we can appreciate that for sure. But how do we know what is justice in a particular situation? That's where revelation comes to be, and that is about moral epistemology as well, and moral ontology to some degree, because would that moral statement be 100% fact? Yes, we would agree that. And to know what that moral statement is, you would have to go to the Quran and Sunnah. So, you know, Allah says, for example, that certain acts are haram, they're wrong, they're immoral, okay? Or that it's a form of injustice. You can only know that through revelation. But the kind of abstract value and property, moral property of justice existing and it being real and it being mind independent, you don't necessarily need revelation for that, for sure. Just like the way Allah spoke to the Quraysh about compassion and justice. But to get into more details about, well, what is justice? What are the moral statements or the moral facts concerning to them, connected to the moral property of justice, that would make us understand what is justice in an applied context. But even in saying that, there is also an argument that the mind or the fitrah can come to an appreciation of certain things that are in line with revelation. But yeah, so this doesn't, just because morals are objective, moral values and properties are objective, it doesn't mean that you don't need Quran and Sunnah anymore. Of course you do. Because remember, moral properties and values are things like justice exists, compassion exists. Okay, but now let's ask the epistemological question. Well, what does it mean to be compassionate? What does it mean to be compassionate in this context? This is where you need guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He knows that we don't. So let me just take one more question, then I need to go. Okay, there's a question here by Shafaq Hassan. Assalamu alaikum. One of the questions asked by theists is, if God is good, why is there so much evil in the world? This is going to be addressed, I think, in September. We have a webinar coming up. Please, on this particular issue, please go to sapiensinstitute.org/webinars for you to understand this topic much better, inshallah. All right, unfortunately, we don't have any more time, but don't worry, we're going to do these webinars again in the next couple of weeks and months. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. Any further questions that you are that you have, please try and revisit this webinar and or ask us a question and we'll try and get back to you. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless every single one of you. Anything that I've said that's good or bad has come. Anything that I said that's good has come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything that I've said that's bad or wrong has come from shaitan. And yeah, may Allah bless every single one of you. Take care of yourselves. Don't forget to register for tomorrow's webinar. It's going to be a beautiful webinar by Sheikh Fahad Taslim on beauty and the recognition of Allah and the recognition of God. So please register for that. May Allah bless every single one of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.